autumn of 1908, the people of Hunterdon County, New Jersey, spoke of one man with a mixture of respect and admiration, Professor Duncan Raymond. To most, he was a symbol of moral virtue, a man whose life seemed guided by intellect, compassion, and unwavering integrity. A former philosophy professor at Princeton University, Duncan had retired early, choosing instead a quieter life devoted to education and philanthropy. His name appeared frequently in the local papers, always associated with charity events, donations to the orphanage, or his lectures on moral philosophy at the municipal library. In every sense, he represented what the community considered the ideal citizen: intelligent, charitable, and profoundly humane. But behind that immaculate facade, there were shadows no one saw. Shadows that would begin to stir after the death of his loyal housekeeper, Vera Clark, in September of that same year. At 52, Vera had worked for the Raymond household since the late 1890s. She was quiet, efficient, and fiercely loyal, the kind of servant whose presence was felt more than seen. When tuberculosis finally took hold of her body, Duncan's concern for her seemed genuine. He called the best doctor from Princeton, arranged for her care, and made sure the town saw his devotion to her well-being. People whispered that he treated his staff like family. But few knew that inside the walls of his modest Victorian home, Vera was not just dying of disease, she was dying of guilt. Duncan's house, perched on a half-acre property just outside the main road, was admired for its simplicity. A two-story Victorian construction with polished oak windows and an attic rarely mentioned, it seemed to reflect its owner's personality, refined but unpretentious. Neighbors often saw him tending to his garden at dawn, sleeves rolled up, humming softly as he trimmed the rose bushes Cordelia had planted years ago. Inside, everything was in perfect order: the ticking of the hall clock, the faint smell of old books, and the careful alignment of furniture. Everything seemed deliberate, symmetrical, almost ritualistic. Duncan was known to rise early, read the morning paper, then walk to the municipal library, where he spent hours lost in conversation about philosophy and the human soul. In the evenings, he returned home to a solitary dinner, often accompanied by candlelight and quiet music. People found comfort in his predictability, a man who sought peace after tragedy. His late wife, Cordelia Marsh Raymond, had died 5 years earlier after a prolonged illness. Her absence was felt deeply by the townsfolk, who admired how Duncan had cared for her through years of suffering. He'd nursed her through every stage of the disease, isolating her from the outside world at the recommendation of doctors, or so he said. When she died, Duncan mourned quietly, never remarrying, never leaving the town that had come to symbolize his moral devotion. No one questioned his story. No one doubted his grief. And no one imagined that everything they believed about Professor Raymond, every act of kindness, every thoughtful gesture, was built on a secret so dark it would tear the heart out of Hunterdon County itself. Long before tragedy and whispers of madness surrounded the Raymond name, Duncan and Cordelia Marsh had been the very picture of harmony. Their marriage in the spring of 1895 was small but elegant, a quiet ceremony held under the golden light of early May, attended by colleagues from Princeton and a few close friends. Duncan, at 32, had already made a name for himself in academic circles for his lectures on ethics and human nature. Cordelia, just 22, had been one of his most promising students, brilliant, articulate, and endlessly curious. Those who knew them said their connection was not born merely of affection but of intellect. They shared long conversations about art, literature, and moral philosophy. Theirs was the union of two minds that seemed destined to understand one another perfectly. In the first years of marriage, the couple became the social centerpiece of Hunterdon's educated class. Cordelia, with her quick wit and delicate charm, hosted tea gatherings for local ladies, while Duncan dazzled visiting professors with his articulate speeches and refined manners. The Raymond home reflected that same balance, elegant yet modest. Its parlor held a small piano, always polished, and shelves filled with leather-bound volumes. A portrait of Cordelia hung above the fireplace, a young woman with serene eyes and a faint, intelligent smile. The scent of rosewater and ink filled the air. She wrote often, sending letters to friends and former classmates, describing her peaceful new life away from the bustle of the city. But somewhere between 1896 and 1897, Those letters stopped. Neighbors began to notice her absence from public gatherings. The charity teas she once hosted were quietly discontinued. Duncan, always polite, explained that Cordelia had been advised by her doctors to rest. Fatigue, he said. Exhaustion from overwork and delicate nerves. It was not unusual for women of her time to withdraw due to female ailments, and so no one pressed the matter further. In polite society, such things were best left unspoken. Months passed, then years. Duncan continued to attend church services alone, to give lectures, to host dinners filled with laughter and thought. His tone was unchanged, his posture upright, his grief, if any, hidden beneath layers of civility. And when asked about his wife, his answers were gentle and vague. "Cordelia is resting comfortably," he would say. "The doctors insist on absolute quiet." He smiled as he said it, always the same smile, always the same calm tone, and no one questioned further. Behind the closed curtains of the Raymond house, Cordelia's world grew smaller by the day. The once vibrant woman who walked freely through town was now confined to her upstairs room, her voice fading from the memory of neighbors. Only one person besides Duncan ever saw her regularly, Vera Clark, the housekeeper hired shortly after the marriage. A quiet woman, loyal and unquestioning, she would become the silent witness to everything that unfolded, the decay of love, the birth of fear, and the slow construction of a secret that would one day horrify the entire county. The Raymonds' marriage had begun as an ideal. Soon it would become a prison built by devotion, silence, and lies. By 1898, whispers had begun to stir in Hunterdon County. No one had seen Cordelia Raymond in more than a year. Her absence from social events, church gatherings, and even brief visits to town had turned from curiosity to quiet unease. Still, Duncan's reputation shielded him from suspicion. He remained the image of patience and refinement, the grieving husband of an ailing wife. When asked, his explanation never changed. Cordelia was too delicate, too fragile for visitors. "Her nerves are still unsteady," he would say, his tone heavy with concern. "The doctors insist on isolation. The light, the sound, even a brief conversation might exhaust her." His composure disarmed everyone. The thought that Duncan could lie, that he might be hiding something far darker than illness, was unthinkable. He was a man of philosophy, a gentleman, a benefactor, the kind of person whose goodness people did not question. But there were moments, small and fleeting, that betrayed something else. A local grocer recalled how Duncan often ordered extra portions of milk, bread and fruit, far more than a household of two required. When questioned, he smiled faintly and mentioned charitable donations to nearby orphanages. Others remembered how his delivery requests always came at odd hours, early dawn or late evening, as if he didn't want anyone lingering near the property. The Raymond home itself began to take on an unsettling stillness. Curtains drawn day and night, lamps burning at strange hours, and sometimes faint sounds, footsteps, or the distant echo of a child's cry, that nearby residents dismissed as the moaning of wind through the trees. Inside those walls, Cordelia's world had shrunk to a single dimly lit room. Duncan told her that the doctors insisted on strict confinement, that the outside world was filled with dangers she was too weak to endure. He read to her, administered medicines, and kept her under constant watch. But the so-called medicines dulled her mind, draining her strength and muting her will. The once brilliant woman who debated moral theory now stared out the window in silence, her eyes unfocused, her body frail. Vera Clark, the loyal housekeeper, obeyed every instruction without question. She brought meals, cleaned discreetly, and followed Duncan's orders to the letter. Yet even she began to feel an unease she could not name. Sometimes she found Cordelia's meals untouched for days or heard muffled sobs behind the locked bedroom door. But whenever she looked to Duncan for explanation, his gaze was calm, unnervingly calm. "Mrs. Raymond is improving," he would say. "But she must not be disturbed. The mind heals best in silence." And Vera, bound by duty and fear, said nothing. By the turn of the century, Cordelia Raymond no longer existed in the public eye. Her name faded from conversations, her face from memory. Duncan attended services alone, his black suit immaculate, his grief understated but moving. To the people of Hunterdon, he was a man carrying the heavy cross of love and loss. Only Vera knew the truth, that Cordelia still lived, but as a ghost within her own home, and that Duncan Raymond, philosopher and philanthropist, had begun his descent into a darkness no one would dare imagine. The night of March 3, 1898, was remembered by no one in Hunterdon County except two people inside the Raymond house. The wind had howled across the fields, rattling window panes and bending the trees under sheets of freezing rain. Inside the locked upstairs chamber, Cordelia Raymond lay twisted in agony. Her time had come, too soon, too weak, and without help. For hours her cries were muffled by the thick curtains Duncan had nailed over the windows. No doctor was called. No light shone from the upper floors. Only Vera Clark moved in and out of the room, her apron stained, her hands trembling as she tried to help the woman who was no longer mistress, but prisoner. Duncan had not planned for this. Cordelia's pregnancy was a secret he had buried beneath layers of lies. Even Vera, obedient and silent, had not known until the 7th month, when Cordelia's frail frame began to swell beneath her nightgowns. He told her to say nothing, that his wife's condition was delicate, and that the child, if born, must never be seen. By dawn, Cordelia's body was failing. She begged Duncan to call for help, to bring a doctor, to save the child. At last his resolve cracked. He sent Vera galloping through the rain with a letter addressed to Dr. Charles Middleton, an aging physician who treated rural families around Hunterdon. Middleton arrived before sunrise, tired, soaked, and already uneasy. What he saw inside that room would haunt him for the rest of his life. The birth was long, violent, and unending. Cordelia's screams echoed until her voice broke. When at last it was over, 2 premature infants lay bundled in thin sheets, a boy and a girl. They were small, weak, gasping for life. Dr. Middleton did what he could, administering tonics and wrapping them in warm cloth, but his attention soon turned to Cordelia, whose bleeding would not stop. He fought for hours to keep her alive, while Duncan stood silent, pale, almost detached. When the chaos finally subsided, Middleton looked at Duncan with the calm pity of a man who had seen too much. "Your wife will live," he said quietly, "but she needs rest, nourishment, and sunlight. These children must be taken to a proper physician in Trenton. They won't survive otherwise." Duncan's reply was chilling in its certainty. "No," he said. "They stay here. My family stays together." Middleton tried to argue, but Duncan's composure never wavered. Moments later, he made an offer that silenced the doctor forever, an envelope thick with cash, more than the old man had earned in years. "You saw nothing," Duncan said. "You attended a difficult illness. That is all." The doctor hesitated, but poverty made honesty heavy. He took the money, left without a word, and never returned. From that day forward, the Raymond house became its own world, a house where 3 secrets drew breath in the dark: a mother too weak to flee, 2 children who should not exist, and a man who believed he could control them all. Outside, the rain washed the road clean. Inside, the real story of Duncan Raymond had only begun. By the summer of 1898, the Raymond residence had transformed from a home into a sealed world, ruled by one man's obsession with control. Duncan Raymond moved through its hallways with quiet precision, his footsteps measured, his voice calm, his every action calculated to maintain the illusion he had created. Outside, neighbors saw a dignified husband tending to his garden, offering polite greetings and philosophical musings at the library. Inside, he was something else entirely: a warden, a manipulator, a man who believed that truth and morality were tools to be shaped by his own reason. Cordelia, frail and pale as paper, lay confined to her room, her health deteriorating under the pretense of medical necessity. Duncan's treatments, a mixture of powders and tonics he administered himself, dulled her senses and left her too weak to resist. He told her it was for her safety, that the outside world was too harsh for her delicate condition. And in her fragile, feverish state, she believed him. Vera Clark, the silent witness, carried out her duties as though hypnotized. She brought food, washed linens, and rocked the newborn twins when Cordelia could not. She saw the way Duncan hovered over the infants, Harold and Georgina, studying them as if they were subjects in one of his philosophical experiments. He spoke softly to them, but his affection had the cold precision of an idea rather than the warmth of love. He told Vera that the children were special, destined for greatness, but fragile. That the world beyond the house would only corrupt them. They must grow here, he said, under his guidance, untouched by the ignorance of society. Vera, uneducated but faithful, accepted this explanation at first. She had no reason to question the man the entire county called a saint. As months passed, Duncan began to seal off portions of the house. The attic became forbidden territory, its windows covered, its floorboards reinforced. Strange noises came from above, sawing, hammering, the dragging of heavy furniture. When Vera finally saw what he was building, her stomach turned. A room within a room, its walls lined with shelves of books, a table with small chairs, and a false window lit by oil lamps behind frosted glass. It was a nursery, but one designed to imitate the outside world, an illusion of daylight in a prison of shadows. The twins grew, pale and wide-eyed, their world limited to the attic and Cordelia's bedroom. Duncan told them stories of monsters beyond the garden walls, of poisonous air, and of people who wanted to steal them away. He taught them that home was safety, that he alone was truth. Cordelia's protests were faint at first, whispered attempts to reason with him. "They need sunlight, Duncan," she pleaded one night. "They're children, not experiments." He looked at her with pity, almost affection, and said softly, "The world destroyed us once. It won't destroy them." After that, the locks on the attic door grew stronger. The laughter of children turned to whispers. And Vera, caught between fear and obedience, convinced herself that silence was the same as kindness. From the street, the Raymond house still appeared immaculate, the garden trimmed, the windows gleaming. But within its walls, time itself had begun to rot. The house was no longer a home. It was a philosophy lesson written in suffering, one that no one outside would ever read. By 1901, the Raymond house had become a world apart, a perfect reflection of Duncan's mind. Everything within it moved according to his logic, his rules, his quiet belief that reason could shape not just thought, but flesh, emotion, and destiny. He no longer considered himself merely a husband or father. He fancied himself a philosopher of life itself, a man chosen to rebuild humanity from the ground up, beginning with his own family. His journals, which Vera sometimes glimpsed when dusting his study, were filled with dense, feverish writing. Morality is a construct of the weak. Order requires truth unpolluted by emotion. I will create purity within these walls. He wrote as if God himself were taking dictation. Cordelia, though weak, had begun to awaken from the fog of his medicines. Her strength returned in fragments, flashes of clarity that revealed the horror around her. She saw her children, now 3 years old, speaking in strange, measured tones, repeating Duncan's words as though they were reciting scripture. They feared sunlight, cried at the sight of strangers, and had never once felt grass beneath their feet. One morning she attempted to take them outside. She carried Harold and Georgina down the stairs, whispering, "We're going to the garden just for a moment, just to feel the air." But before she reached the front door, Duncan appeared, calm, collected, with a faint smile that never touched his eyes. "Cordelia," he said softly, "you're still unwell. The children aren't ready. You could harm them." He didn't shout. He never needed to. His calmness was more terrifying than any rage. He gently took the children from her arms, handed them to Vera, and led Cordelia back upstairs. That night her medicine dosage doubled. For days afterward, she slept as though the world had ended. Vera tried to speak once, just once. "Sir, they need sunlight," she said, her voice trembling. "They're so pale." "They look sick." Duncan turned to her slowly, studying her face. Then he said something she would never forget. "Do not mistake comfort for love, Miss Clark. The greatest kindness is discipline. The world outside is diseased. I am curing them of it." After that, Vera never spoke of it again. In his private hours, Duncan conducted what he called lessons of purity. He made the twins repeat moral paradoxes, recite lines from Bentham Mill and his own writings, blending philosophy with fear. Pain is temporary, he would tell them, but control is eternal. They learned obedience before language. They learned silence before laughter. They learned that love was not something given, but something earned through perfection. To visitors, Duncan's behavior remained impeccable. He donated books to the local school, gave eloquent talks on moral philosophy, and even contributed to the town's church fund. He was the model of intellect and civility. No one knew that upstairs, his doctrine had turned into doctrine of madness, a living experiment in control and isolation. By winter, even the servants who once helped Vera had left. Only the three of them remained. A man who called himself a savior, a woman who had forgotten the sound of her own name, and two children raised to believe that the sun was sin. And yet, somewhere beneath the layers of fear, Cordelia's old self began to stir. She had begun to remember who she once was, before Duncan's logic, before the House of Silence. That flicker of defiance, though faint, would soon change everything. By the spring of 1902, the Raymond estate had grown eerily still. The sound of laughter had vanished years ago, replaced by the rhythmic creak of floorboards and the faint echo of Duncan's measured footsteps. But beneath that suffocating silence, something was changing, not in Duncan's world, but in Cordelia's. After years of forced sedation, her body had begun to resist his tonics. The bitter powders no longer dulled her mind completely. Fragments of memory and clarity began to break through. The scent of magnolia trees from her youth, the feel of sunlight on her face, the sound of a piano in her father's house. And with every memory came a question. What have I become? What has he done to us? Cordelia began to act. Quietly, carefully. When Duncan left for his lectures in town, she started to hide the doses Vera brought her. A sip here, a spill there, enough to appear compliant but keep her mind awake. She began to watch, to listen. She learned that Duncan kept a second set of journals in the locked drawer of his study, separate from the public notebooks filled with philosophy. Vera, frightened but loyal to Cordelia, finally revealed where he kept the key. It was hidden behind a small portrait of the twins, painted by a local artist years earlier when they were still infants. Cordelia's trembling hands found it one night when the house slept. The lock clicked open, and for the first time in years, she read Duncan's true words. The pages were meticulous, written with the cold passion of a scientist. But what they described was horror disguised as theory. Control is the final mercy. Emotion breeds chaos. Isolation breeds purity. The twins will grow to reflect uncorrupted will, truth untainted by sentiment. Cordelia's fragility proves my hypothesis. Compassion weakens the human order. Cordelia's tears fell onto the ink. He had turned their lives, their love, their children, into an experiment. That night she went to the attic. The children were awake, pale figures illuminated by the false glow of Duncan's lamp window. When she opened the door, they stared at her as though seeing a stranger. "Don't be afraid," she whispered. "We're leaving soon." They didn't understand. They had never seen beyond those walls. Harold touched her hand and asked, "Is the world real, Mama?" Her voice broke. "Yes," she said, "and it's beautiful." But freedom would not come easily. Duncan noticed the smallest changes. A sharper gaze in Cordelia's eyes, the children whispering to her when they thought he wasn't listening. He began to keep his journal in his coat pocket and started giving her new doses himself, watching her swallow every spoonful. Still, Cordelia's will had hardened. The fear that once paralyzed her had turned into quiet defiance. Every night she rehearsed what she would do, how she would gather the children, how she would reach the stable, how she would ride until morning broke. For the first time in years she prayed, not for forgiveness, but for strength. And in that prayer, something within her shifted. She no longer saw Duncan as the man she had married, nor as the genius the world admired. He was a jailer, a zealot, a god of his own creation. And gods, she decided, could bleed. The night of October 12, 1902, began like every other inside the Raymond house, silent, candlelit, and suffocatingly still. But for Cordelia, it was the night she had been waiting for. Weeks of secret preparation had led to this single moment. She had hidden bits of food in the lining of her shawl. She had loosened the screws of the attic door with a butter knife stolen from the kitchen. Vera, pale with terror, had promised to keep the housemaid's bell ringing in the kitchen if Duncan stirred. Everything depended on timing and courage. Outside, the first frost of autumn had settled across the fields, silvering the grass beneath the moonlight. The horses in the stable were restless, their breath rising in faint clouds. Cordelia knew that once she reached them, she might have a chance, a single chance, to cross the wooded road to Trenton before dawn. At a little after 11, Duncan retired to his study as always, a candle flickering behind the frosted glass door. Cordelia waited an hour, then 2. When the clock struck 1, she rose. Her bare feet moved soundlessly across the cold wooden floor. The house seemed to hold its breath. She climbed the attic stairs and opened the door. Harold and Georgina were awake. They always were. They sat side by side, their faces ghost-pale in the false lamplight. When she entered, they looked up at her, wide-eyed, uncertain. "Children," she whispered, "we're leaving." They didn't move. They had never heard that word before. Leaving. Cordelia wrapped them in blankets, one under each arm, and led them down the narrow corridor. Every creak of the floor sounded like thunder. Every flicker of wind outside made her heart race. She reached the side door, turned the key Vera had left under the mat, and stepped into the cold night. The first breath of real air in years hit her lungs like fire. She almost cried out. The children clung to her, their eyes wide with wonder. Above them, the sky stretched endless and dark, their first sight of stars. For a moment, it seemed as though she might succeed. But then a voice broke the silence. Calm, controlled, icy. "Cordelia," Duncan said behind her. "Where are you taking my children?" She froze. The lamp from the study door glowed behind him, casting his shadow long across the frost. His expression wasn't anger. It was disappointment, the kind a teacher gives a student who fails a lesson. "Step inside," he said softly. "You'll wake them." Cordelia held the children tighter. "They deserve to live, Duncan, outside, in sunlight, like human beings." He took a step forward, voice even colder now. "They deserve truth, and the world offers none. You'd throw them into chaos for the sake of sentiment." She backed away, her foot striking a loose stone. The sound echoed. The twins began to cry. In that instant, something primal overtook her. Fear and fury fused into one. She turned, grabbed Harold's hand, and ran. Duncan shouted her name once, then again. Behind her came the sound of boots on gravel. He was faster than she remembered. Cordelia reached the stable, thrust the door open, and lifted Georgina onto a horse. But before she could climb up, Duncan's hand clamped down on her wrist. "Don't make me hurt you," he whispered. Her reply came like a blade. "You already have." The horse reared, startled by the noise. Georgina slipped, screaming. In the chaos, a lantern overturned. Flames leapt from the straw to the wooden beams above. Within seconds, the stable was ablaze, fire roaring into the night sky, devouring years of silence in a single violent breath. Cordelia dragged the children away as Duncan shouted orders, trying to smother the flames. But the fire spread too fast. When it was finally extinguished hours later, half the outbuildings were gone, and the twins were nowhere to be found. The sheriff would come at dawn, summoned by the smoke. Duncan's calm explanations would falter for the first time. The Raymond secret, buried for years, had finally begun to surface. By sunrise, the quiet fields of Hunterdon County were alive with whispers. The Raymond fire had burned through the night, visible for miles, a pillar of smoke twisting into the pale dawn sky. Farmers who rode out to help found Duncan Raymond standing in the ruins of his stable, soot on his face, eyes hollow and distant. He told them there had been an accident. A lantern overturned. His wife was in shock. The children, he said this carefully, were missing. The story spread through the town before midday. By noon, Sheriff Milton Graves arrived at the property with 2 deputies. He was an old friend of Duncan's late father, and though he respected the Raymond name, there was something in the man's calm that set him on edge. Most men who lost children spoke in panic or grief. Duncan spoke like a man giving a lecture. Inside the house, Graves found Cordelia in her room, pale and trembling, her dress torn, her hair matted with ash. She clutched a damp shawl and stared past him when he spoke. "Mrs. Raymond," he said gently, "can you tell me what happened?" Her lips moved, but no words came. Then softly she whispered, "The children, the stars, They'd never seen the stars. The sheriff frowned. Were they in the fire? Cordelia shook her head. No, she said. They were running. It was the only clear sentence she spoke that day. Graves searched the property for hours. The fields yielded nothing. No footprints beyond the stable, no signs of the twins. In the smoldering debris, they found scraps of burnt cloth that might have been part of a child's blanket. Duncan identified them immediately, claiming they belonged to Georgina. It's over, he told the sheriff. They're gone. But something in his eyes, that cold, precise composure, told Graves it wasn't over at all. When Graves returned the next morning, he brought Dr. Charles Middleton, the aging physician who had attended Cordelia years earlier. The doctor was reluctant, almost fearful, but when he saw her condition, the tremors, the gaunt face, the lingering traces of narcotics, his guilt erupted. He told Graves everything, the secret birth, the hidden children, the bribes, the silence. That testimony shattered Duncan's carefully built illusion. By evening, word reached the courthouse in Trenton. A judge issued an order to take Cordelia into medical custody and to detain Duncan pending further inquiry. But when the deputies returned to serve the warrant, Duncan was gone. His study was empty, his journals missing, his carriage tracks vanishing into the dense woods north of the property. Cordelia was moved to St. Mary's Asylum, still whispering the same phrase. They're out there. They're under the stars. In the following days, the woods were searched by dozens of men. They found nothing, no bodies, no signs of life, not even footprints beyond the frost. And yet, on the 5th night after the fire, one of the search parties swore they heard something faint through the trees, the sound of a child singing. A lullaby, slow, haunting, and distant. When they followed it, the voice faded into the wind. No one ever found Harold or Georgina Raymond, and as for Duncan, some said he fled the country. Others whispered he never left those woods at all. The night Duncan Raymond vanished from Hunterdon County was cold, the kind of chill that silences every sound but the wind. The last confirmed sighting came from a farmer named Elias Monroe, who claimed to have seen a carriage traveling along the dirt road that cut through the woods north of Raymond's property. It was near midnight, the lamps unlit, the horses running as though chased by something unseen. Monroe said he recognized the outline of Duncan's shoulders through the fog, rigid, still upright as a statue. When authorities arrived the next morning, they found the carriage abandoned at the edge of Raven Hollow Creek, its wheels sunk deep into the mud. Inside were only a few scattered belongings, a leather-bound notebook, a broken pocket watch, and a small velvet pouch containing a child's hair ribbon, blue, singed at the edge. The discovery chilled even the most hardened deputies. A search of the woods continued for 3 days. Bloodhounds picked up a faint scent that led down toward the riverbank, where the current ran fast and dark. At one point, searchers thought they saw footprints, adult-sized, and then smaller ones beside them. But the rain came suddenly that afternoon, washing away every trace. By the 4th day, Sheriff Graves was forced to concede what no one wanted to admit. Duncan Raymond was gone. Whether drowned, escaped, or something worse, no one could say. The notebook found in the carriage became the center of the investigation. Inside were fragments of Duncan's handwriting, observations, philosophical musings, and scattered notes on what he called the doctrine of innocence. Much of it seemed to be reflections on moral purity, the preservation of virtue and the corruption of knowledge. But in the margins, Graves found something else. Drawings of floor plans, measurements of rooms and diagrams of the human mind divided into obedience, fear, and purity. It wasn't a philosophy notebook. It was a blueprint for control. One passage, dated April 1904, read, "The mind of a child is a closed garden. Left untouched, it will bloom into perfection. But when the world intrudes, when voices of doubt, greed, or desire enter, that purity dies. Therefore, isolation is salvation." Another, scribbled in haste, said only, "Cordelia no longer understands. She wants them to see the world. I cannot let her undo what I've built." When the investigators read those lines, silence filled the room. It became clear that Duncan's philosophy, once praised in lecture halls, had turned into obsession. What began as theory had become doctrine, and what began as protection had become imprisonment. Within a week, the story spread beyond Hunterdon County. Newspapers from Princeton to Philadelphia carried headlines about the philosopher of horror. Former students wrote letters of disbelief. A man once admired for moral clarity had become the center of one of New Jersey's darkest mysteries. But the most haunting discovery came later, when Dr. Middleton, burdened by guilt, revealed something he had kept even from the sheriff. Years earlier, Duncan had requested special medical tonics for sensitive patients. Middleton had assumed they were for Cordelia, until he saw the precise dosages listed in the notebook, matched those safe for children under 10. That revelation changed everything. The hunt for Duncan intensified, stretching across neighboring states, but no trace of him was ever found. No body, no sightings, no final letter. Only the faint, unending question: what became of the man who thought he could build a perfect world? Some said he drowned in the river that night, swallowed by the same darkness he had created. Others whispered he had taken the children with him, vanishing into the woods to start again, far from eyes that judged him. And in Hunterdon County, on quiet nights when the fog rolls over Raven Hollow Creek, locals still swear they see the faint light of a lantern moving through the trees, as if Duncan Raymond never left at all. After Duncan's disappearance, the Raymond property was sealed under court order. The once elegant Victorian home now stood as a monument of dread, windows shuttered, curtains drawn, the garden overgrown with ivy and silence. Neighbors avoided walking past it at night. Even in daylight, the place seemed to breathe unease. A week later, Sheriff Graves obtained permission to search the entire residence. What he and his men found inside would mark the beginning of one of the most disturbing discoveries in the county's history. The ground floor appeared ordinary, bookshelves perfectly dusted, furniture arranged with mathematical precision. The scent of lavender still lingered, faint but distinct. On the dining table lay a single glass of water, half full, as if waiting for someone's return. But when the deputies began exploring the upper levels, the illusion of normalcy collapsed. Behind a locked door at the end of the corridor, a door that Vera's letter had mentioned, they found the entrance to the attic chamber. The door had been sealed with heavy iron bolts, not from the outside, but from within. It took nearly 20 minutes to force it open. What awaited them beyond it froze every man where he stood. The attic had been transformed into something between a nursery and a laboratory of the mind. The walls were painted with stars, moons, and clouds, drawn in crude, childlike strokes. A row of wooden toys lined one corner, carved horses, miniature soldiers, dolls missing their eyes. The air smelled of chalk dust, candle wax, and something else, something faintly sweet and decayed. On a table at the center lay several notebooks filled with lessons written in Duncan's hand: arithmetic, philosophy, and moral exercises addressed to H and G. The pages alternated between gentle lessons and strange warnings. The world is false. Truth lives only in silence. Never look through the window when the lights are out. Near the back wall stood 2 narrow beds, each with neatly folded blankets. Beneath them, the deputies found drawings, hundreds of them. Some depicted flowers and animals. Others showed human figures with blank faces, surrounded by dark shapes reaching toward them. But the most disturbing discovery came from a trap door beneath the floorboards. Inside was a compartment lined with tin, insulated to muffle sound. It contained a small lantern, several glass bottles labeled Calm and Quietus, and 2 pairs of iron restraints. The realization came slowly, but when it did, no one spoke. The room wasn't just a prison. It was a stage for Duncan's twisted experiments in control. In a far corner, Sheriff Graves found a small wooden box. Inside were clippings of children's hair, 2 sets, one blonde, one chestnut, tied with ribbon. Alongside them, a faded photograph, Cordelia holding 2 infants, her face blurred from long exposure. Graves closed the box and ordered everyone out. For the first time in his career, he couldn't finish a search. The following morning, the attic was sealed again, this time under the authority of the state. Officials cataloged everything, but many items were quietly removed before public records were filed. The county coroner later described the place as A shrine to delusion. Word of the discovery spread like wildfire. Reporters flooded the town, turning the Raymond estate into a symbol of corrupted genius. Some painted Duncan as a madman, others as a misunderstood visionary. But to those who had lived near him, the ones who had waved to him in passing, received his charity, and praised his virtue. It felt like a betrayal carved into the heart of their community. And as autumn deepened, a single rumor began to spread that on still nights, lights could be seen flickering in the attic again. Long after the house had been abandoned, no one ever found out who lit them. By the end of October 1908, the mystery of Harold and Georgina Raymond had consumed Hunterdon County. Newspapers from as far as Boston ran the story under headlines like "The Children in the Attic" and "The Philosopher's Prison." Yet for all the speculation, no one could answer the most haunting question of all. Where were the children? Sheriff Graves led multiple searches across the surrounding forests, aided by local volunteers and state investigators. For 2 weeks, they combed through miles of dense undergrowth, creeks, and abandoned barns. Dogs were brought from Trenton, trained to trace the scent from clothes found in the attic. But the animals grew restless near the tree line and refused to go farther. It was as if something in those woods made even beasts afraid. Every lead ended in silence. No remains, no footprints, no sound but wind through the branches. Then, on November 3rd, a farmer named Caleb Turner arrived at the sheriff's office with a claim that sent shivers through the entire town. 2 nights earlier, while returning from a livestock auction, Turner said he'd seen a small figure near the edge of his property. Barefoot, pale, with hair so light it almost glowed under the moon. He called out, thinking it was a neighbor's child lost after dark. The figure turned toward him but didn't speak. When he approached, it ran, silently, impossibly fast, vanishing into the fog toward Raven Hollow Creek. Turner swore it wasn't imagination. He even found footprints the next morning, small, unmistakably human, leading toward the old mill path. Graves ordered another search, focusing on that area. For 2 days they followed the trail through mud and frost until it ended abruptly beside the water, as if the prints simply disappeared. One deputy said the ground around the creek was disturbed, not like someone had walked there, but like something had been dragged into or out of the water. That night, locals began reporting strange occurrences near the Raymond estate. Windows that had been boarded up appeared open again in the morning. Some claimed to hear children's laughter drifting through the fields just before dawn. Others said they saw candlelight flickering behind the attic windows. The sheriff dismissed these as hysteria, the product of fear and rumor, but privately he wasn't sure. Dr. Middleton, overcome with guilt, returned to the property one last time, hoping to find closure. He spent hours in the attic, reading the children's journals left behind. The writings were rudimentary, misspelled, and fragmented, yet painfully coherent. They spoke of lessons about purity, of voices under the floor, and of a garden that isn't real. The children wrote about stars they were forbidden to see and about Father's voice, which they described as both kind and terrible. One passage in Georgina's small notebook read, "Father says the world outside will burn our eyes. But when I look through the hole in the roof, I see the moon, and it doesn't hurt at all." Dr. Middleton left the house shaken and weeping, whispering, "God forgive us." In December, with no physical evidence to prove whether the twins lived or died, the case was officially closed. The coroner listed the children as missing, presumed deceased. Duncan Raymond was declared a fugitive, though no body was ever found. The Raymond estate was placed under government custody, later sold to a family from Pennsylvania who left after less than a year. Claiming the place was alive with whispers, it remained vacant for decades. Yet, on rare nights, travelers along the old Hunterdon road still reported seeing 2 small shapes wandering near the edge of the woods, holding hands, silent, pale, and looking toward the stars they were once forbidden to see. In the years that followed, the story of Duncan Raymond faded into the uneasy folklore of New Jersey's countryside, a tale parents whispered to frighten children into obedience, and historians avoided for its unsettling lack of resolution. Yet beneath the myths, the true legacy of the man once called the philosopher of Hunterdon was far darker than anyone dared to admit. After the case was closed, officials combed through Raymond's writings. What they discovered filled 4 crates, notebooks, diaries, and pages torn from medical journals. Every line revealed the mind of a man who had slipped beyond reason, yet clung to logic as his weapon. He wrote about restructuring the soul through suffering, claiming that pain stripped the human spirit of corruption. He spoke of his children not as people, but as experiments of purity, subjects in what he called the doctrine of the clean mind. In one entry, written just months before the tragedy, Raymond confessed, "The world outside has become a theater of lies. Only in isolation can truth bloom. My children shall inherit a mind unclouded by society." Dr. Middleton, who helped organize these papers, described reading them as walking through the corridors of a collapsing mind. He believed Raymond's brilliance, his obsession with philosophy, theology, and science had consumed itself, turning intellect into madness. He saw himself as a savior, Middleton wrote later, but in the end, he became the thing he feared most, a god of his own making. The public, however, never saw these writings. Many were locked away in the state archives, labeled psychological exhibits, restricted access. A few leaked over the years, reprinted in obscure occult journals that twisted Raymond's words into strange, modern philosophies about ascetic purity and spiritual detachment. For some, he became a martyr of misunderstood genius. For others, he was a monster hiding behind intellect. The house itself stood as a silent reminder of what he had done. No one lived there for long. Tenants complained of footsteps pacing the attic or the sound of a man speaking softly when no one else was home. In 1921, a traveling photographer documented the estate. The attic window cracked open, vines creeping through. When he developed the plate, he claimed to see 2 faint silhouettes near the upper window, like children standing hand in hand. By the 1940s, the Raymond property had become overgrown and half-collapsed. Teenagers dared each other to enter the ruins, calling it the philosopher's house. A local paper ran a story titled Hunterdon's Haunted Genius, turning the tragedy into entertainment. But the few who actually went inside came back shaken. Some spoke of a smell of damp books and iron. Others swore they heard whispering, a man's voice reciting something in Latin. In claritate dolor nascitur. In clarity, pain is born. By the 1960s, the last remains of the estate were demolished, and the land was sold for farmland. Yet, even after the ruins were gone, the earth itself seemed restless. Farmers claimed their crops near the old foundation grew twisted, their roots gnarled like clenched hands. And so, the name Duncan Raymond lived on, not in textbooks or university halls, but in the uneasy silence of those who remembered. His dream of creating purity ended in ruin, but his shadow lingered, not as a ghost, but as a question. How thin is the line between enlightenment and insanity? In 1973, almost 70 years after the Raymond case was declared closed, a young archivist named Eleanor Price was tasked with cataloging old court and psychiatric documents at the Hunterdon County Records Office. She was meticulous, quiet, and fascinated by forgotten stories, the kind of person who treated every dusty box like a message from the dead. One cold afternoon, while sorting through mislabeled materials from the early 1900s, Eleanor discovered a set of unregistered folders. They were bound with deteriorated twine, marked only with a fading number, 42BR. Inside were papers yellowed by time, police notes, doctor's observations, and fragments of personal correspondence. She quickly realized what she was holding: the lost files of Duncan Raymond. The contents were disturbing from the first page. There were photographs of the house before it was sealed, the attic room with its narrow beds, small shoes lined neatly beneath them, and strange chalk drawings on the walls. One image showed a wooden desk with a single sentence carved into its surface: "We are learning to be still." There were reports from Sheriff Graves himself, some never released to the public. One dated November 14, 1908, described a basement enclosure not noted in earlier searches. Inside, the sheriff wrote, "They found a narrow pit, covered by planks, filled with damp soil and straw. It smelled of decay." The report ended abruptly with the words, "Further excavation advised, postponed due to weather." No follow-up file was ever attached. Eleanor trembled as she read. She cross-checked the file references, only to find they had been deliberately removed from the official index sometime in the 1910s. It was as if someone had wanted the Raymond investigation erased from public record. Among the papers, she found letters from Dr. Middleton addressed to the State Mental Hospital in Trenton. In one, dated 1909, Middleton confessed his growing unease about the investigation's conclusion. "We were too eager to bury what we didn't understand," he wrote. There were elements in the house, structural, symbolic, spiritual, that didn't belong to one man's madness. They felt inherited, like a sickness passed through walls. Attached to this letter was a small envelope containing a photograph. The image was grainy and underexposed, but it clearly depicted two figures, children, standing near the old Raymond well. Their eyes were pale, reflective, and their expressions unreadable. On the back, in Middleton's shaky handwriting, was written, "Taken 1 year after the house was..." Eleanor took the files home that night, intending to scan and preserve them before returning them to storage. But within days she began to feel watched. Books fell from her shelves without reason. The sound of scratching echoed behind her apartment walls. Once, late at night, she awoke to the faint whisper of a child humming an unfamiliar tune. She told a colleague at the records office, who dismissed her fears as exhaustion. But weeks later, Eleanor stopped coming to work. Her apartment was found unlocked, tea still warm on the table. The Raymond files stacked neatly on her desk, except for one photograph, missing from the envelope. When police developed the negatives that remained, they found a final image, one Eleanor had apparently taken herself. It showed the reflection of her own living room window. But behind her, just barely visible, were two faint silhouettes, small and motionless, watching from the darkness outside. By the time the Raymond case reached its quiet end, almost no one alive remembered the true faces of Harold and Georgina Raymond. Their names became whispers, reduced to ghost stories told at campfires or used to frighten disobedient children. Yet, as decades passed, something about their story refused to stay buried. It returned, in fragments and echoes, every generation or so, like the faint tolling of a distant bell no one could locate. In 1996, a small team of graduate students from Rutgers University decided to make the case the subject of a local history documentary. They gained access to the sealed archives, including Eleanor Price's rediscovered files. The more they read, the less it felt like mere history, and the more it felt like a warning. They found proof that the excavation Sheriff Graves once postponed had never been completed. Old maps of the Raymond property showed a hidden cellar that no demolition crew had ever documented. With permission from the landowners, the students visited the site, now nothing more than a field of weeds and scattered stones. But when they reached the area where the foundation once stood, one of them, a young man named Caleb Morris, noticed a patch of ground where the soil was unnaturally soft, even after decades of erosion. They dug, less than 3 feet down. They uncovered fragments of wood and corroded nails, the remains of a trapdoor. Beneath it lay a narrow shaft reinforced with brick, the same kind the sheriff had mentioned in 1908. Inside, they found what looked like remnants of a small chamber, a rotted chair, broken glass jars, and scraps of paper sealed in wax. The papers disintegrated at touch, but a few words were still legible, phrases like "lesson complete" and "light without eyes." The students reported their find, but officials dismissed it as unrelated debris from an old cellar. The land was recovered, sealed again by time and bureaucracy. But the footage they captured remained, grainy, shaking, filmed in low light. In the recording, as the camera pans toward the hole, there's a faint sound. Not wind, not echo, but something like a child's breath, followed by a whisper. When the tape was played later, one of the crew claimed he could make out the words, "We are still learning." After that, the team abandoned the project. None of them ever finished the documentary. Caleb Morris, the one who first uncovered the trapdoor, left school a year later. He stopped answering letters and eventually disappeared while hiking in Pennsylvania. Today, the Raymond estate is gone, erased by farmland and silence. Yet locals still speak of strange things near the old property, flickering lights, laughter under the trees, and the feeling that you're being watched when you drive that stretch of road after midnight. Some say if you stop your car and listen closely, you can still hear the faint tapping of chalk on wood, like children writing lessons in an attic that no longer exists. What began as the ambition of a man to create purity ended as a monument to corruption, madness, and grief. The house may have crumbled, the records may have been lost, but what Duncan Raymond built, the isolation, the suffering, the silence, never truly died. Because innocence, once broken, leaves behind something far more enduring than ghosts. It leaves behind echoes, quiet, persistent, and eternal. The house is gone now, the people who lived there, forgotten by time. But on certain nights, when the wind moves through Hunterdon's empty fields, you can still hear it, the faint laughter of children, and the whisper of a father who wanted to make them pure. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe, share, and join us again as we uncover the forgotten shadows of history.